Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into a part of history that's well, it's both fascinating and honestly pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, go.
We're talking about the experiences of Native Americans and First Nations peoples during the 19th century.
Right, in the U.S. and Canada.
Exactly.
Okay.
We're using this lecture transcript
Oh, okay.
from Mr. Hutchings History,
Gotcha.
and it's titled Civil Rights Struggles, Native Americans in the USA and Canada in the 19th Century.
Wow.
And just to give you a sense of the scope of what we're talking about here, by 1934, Native Americans had lost a staggering 2/3 of their land.
It's a period that I think is absolutely key
Mhm.
to understanding the challenges that many Indigenous communities face even now.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff, but crucial to grasp the full picture.
Okay, so to get into it, the lecture asks these two big questions.
Right.
First, how and to what extent did Native Americans achieve equality in the USA after 1945?
Right?
And second, the same question for First Peoples in Canada after 1945.
That makes sense.
But to really understand this, we kind of need to rewind back to the 1800s.
Sure, yeah.
It's like trying to understand a movie's ending without seeing the first two acts.
Exactly. And you can't talk about this era without talking about westward expansion in the U.S.
Right.
The idea of manifest destiny, this belief that American settlers were destined to expand across the entire continent, it really fueled a lot of what happened.
So it's like this huge land grab, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And it led to the displacement of countless Native Americans and a long list of broken treaties.
Yeah, wow.
To give you a concrete example, the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851 funded the creation of reservations.
All right.
You might think, okay, reservations, land set aside for Native Americans?
Right.
That sounds good, right?
Well, in theory, maybe.
But that's where the irony comes in.
Yeah.
These reservations, instead of being safe havens,
Right.
often became tools of control and isolation.
Yeah.
Imagine being forced to leave your ancestral homelands
Right.
and relocate to land that's often less fertile or doesn't support your traditional way of life.
And that's a story that resonates even today, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Many reservations still struggle with poverty and lack of resources, and it's a direct result of these policies from way back then.
Absolutely. It's like a ripple effect that's still being felt generations later.
Yeah.
And of course, not everyone just accepted this forced relocation.
Right.
The Great Sioux War of 1876-77
Yeah.
is a stark reminder of the fierce resistance some tribes put up against these policies.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's a reminder that history is never just a passive story. There's always pushback, always a fight for what's right.
It makes you realize how strong that resistance was, even in the face of such overwhelming odds.
Absolutely.
And then there's the Dawes Act of 1887.
Yeah.
From what I've read, it was presented as this helpful measure. But in reality,
It was basically a land grab in disguise.
Yeah.
See, the Dawes Act took communally held tribal lands, land that these communities had relied on for generations,
right.
and split them up into individual parcels given to Native families.
Okay.
Sounds okay on the surface, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
But then that leftover land, the land that wasn't allotted, was sold off to white settlers.
So it's like they were systematically dismantling their traditional ways of life.
Exactly.
It's heartbreaking to think about how this impacted their sense of community and self-sufficiency.
Exactly. It forced them into a system that was inherently designed to disadvantage them.
Yeah.
And tragically, this wasn't the only attempt to erase their culture.
Right.
No.
It's almost like they were trying to erase their entire identity. And that brings us to the boarding schools in the U.S.,
Yeah.
which is a truly dark chapter in this story.
These schools were specifically designed to assimilate Native American children,
Right.
to strip them of their language, their traditions, their very sense of self.
It's just horrifying to
Yeah.
think of the trauma those children endured. Being ripped away from their homes and forced to conform.
It was brutal.
It's hard to even imagine.
And the effects of that trauma are still being felt today.
Yeah.
The loss of language,
Yeah.
the breakdown of cultural practices,
Right.
the intergenerational trauma that continues to impact Native communities
Wow.
is all tied to these policies.
Yeah.
There's a famous quote by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School,
Okay.
that really sums up the thinking behind this system.
Okay.
He said, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
That's chilling.
Yeah.
It's so clear that they were trying to completely eradicate their culture. And sadly, this wasn't just happening in the U.S.
Right.
In Canada, they had a similar system with the Indian Act of 1876.
That's right. The Indian Act was Canada's version of the U.S. reservation system,
Right.
and it was all about control and assimilation.
Okay.
This act gave an incredible amount of power to white government officials
Yeah.
over Indigenous communities.
Right.
They controlled their movement, their economic activities, even their cultural practices.
So basically, two sides of the same coin, just in different countries.
That's right.
And this leads to another dark chapter.
Yeah.
The residential school system in Canada.
Yeah.
It was Canada's version of the U.S. boarding schools,
Exactly.
and the impact was just as devastating.
These schools were full of abuse.
It's awful.
And the recent discoveries of unmarked graves at former residential school sites
Right.
have really brought the horrors of this system to light.
Ooh.
It's a stark reminder of the injustices that took place
Yeah.
and the urgent need for acknowledgement and reconciliation.
But amidst all of this oppression and injustice,
Mhm.
there were also incredible acts of resistance.
Absolutely, yeah.
Native Americans and First Nations people never gave up fighting for their rights and their culture.
Absolutely. Leaders like Sitting Bull Geronimo and Chief Joseph
Right.
actively resisted forced relocation and fought to defend their homelands.
Chief Joseph's story in particular is incredibly moving. His surrender speech during the Nez Perce War of 1877, where he famously said, "I will fight no more forever,"
Right.
speaks volumes about the toll these conflicts took
Yeah.
and the incredible resilience of Indigenous peoples.
It's a testament to their unwavering spirit
Yeah.
in the face of such adversity.
Yeah.
And the resistance wasn't limited to the U.S.
Right.
In Canada, Louis Riel led two Métis Rebellions in 1870 and 1885.
You know, for those of us who aren't familiar, could you tell us a bit about the Métis?
Of course, the Métis are a distinct Indigenous people with mixed Indigenous and European ancestry.
Okay.
They have their own unique culture, traditions, and language.
Got it, yeah.
In the 19th century, they were fighting against Canadian expansion westward
Right.
and the imposition of laws that threatened their land rights and cultural practices.
It's important to remember that resistance took many forms.
Exactly, yeah.
It wasn't always about large-scale conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
Everyday acts of defiance also played a crucial role.
Exactly things like secretly holding on to their traditional ceremonies,
Mm.
preserving their languages,
Right.
maintaining their traditional forms of governance.
Wow.
These were all acts of resistance.
Yeah.
These were the ways they kept their culture and identity alive in the face of enormous pressure to assimilate.
It's a testament to the enduring strength of their culture
Absolutely.
and their unwavering commitment to their heritage.
Yeah.
It's almost like looking through a photo album.
Mm-hmm.
You see the pain, the forced assimilation, the attempts to wipe away their identity.
Right.
But you also see the strength, the resilience, the unwavering fight for their culture and their rights.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it's important to remember that there are different ways of interpreting this period of history.
Okay.
There are various schools of thought that offer different perspectives
Right.
on the events and the motivations behind them.
I imagine that adds another layer of complexity to understanding this period.
It does.
Could you give us an example of these different perspectives?
Certainly, on one hand, you have historians who believe these policies, while harmful in their execution,
Mm-hmm.
stemmed from a genuine,
Okay.
though misguided,
Right.
desire to civilize Indigenous populations.
So it's like a paternalistic approach.
Right.
Like they thought they knew what was best for these communities,
Right.
even though they were completely disregarding their culture and traditions.
That's one way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are other historians who take a much more critical stance.
Okay.
They argue that these policies were never about helping Indigenous peoples,
Right.
but rather about seizing control of their lands and resources.
That makes a lot of sense considering the ultimate outcome of these policies.
Exactly.
It's hard to argue with the devastating loss of land and the economic hardship that followed.
Exactly. And these contrasting interpretations show us that history is rarely black and white.
Yeah, for sure.
It's about grappling with complex motivations, unintended consequences,
Right.
and the lasting legacies of these actions.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how we interpret history and whose voices are being heard.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those central questions from the lecture.
Right.
Have Native Americans and First Nations peoples achieved equality?
Yeah, it's not an easy answer, is it?
Not at all.
It seems like even though there's been some progress, the effects of these policies from the 1800s are still felt today.
Absolutely. We can't ignore the disparities that still exist.
Right, in healthcare, education, economic opportunities.
It's a constant struggle.
So where do we go from here? It's heavy stuff to think about.
It is, but I think understanding this history is so important.
Yeah.
It helps us challenge the systems that perpetuate these inequalities.
I think it's also about recognizing the resilience of Native Americans and First Nations peoples.
Absolutely. Their strength and spirit are incredible.
They've faced so much adversity, but they never stopped fighting for their rights and their culture.
And that fight continues today.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the biggest takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I hope they'll be inspired to learn more,
Yeah.
to seek out Indigenous voices and perspectives,
To really understand their experiences.
their challenges and their triumphs.
It's about acknowledging the past and how it shapes the present,
Exactly.
and finding ways to create a more just and equitable future.
This isn't just about history, it's about today and tomorrow.
Well said. So, to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. What can we do as individuals to contribute to positive change and reconciliation? How can we make a difference? Keep learning, keep listening, and keep engaging with these important issues.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.